Sort of an odd setup in today's gospel lesson. Some religious intellectuals who deny that there is a resurrection ask a question about resurrection. Kind of odd, don't you think, to ask a question about something you don't believe in? Maybe odd, but frankly, I don't think it was an honest question about the resurrection in the first place. The Sadducees were a powerful political and religious party that stood in opposition to the Pharisees. We hear a lot more about the Pharisees in the New Testament. The Sadducees were an intellectually elite group. They based their teachings entirely on what we know as the first 5 books of the Bible. They called it the Torah. And if it wasn't in the Torah, then it wasn't part of their teaching. And since Moses, they said, did not teach about the resurrection, the Sadducees concluded that there was no such thing. Still, their question to Jesus was not intended to spark some theological discussion or even debate. It was an absurd question that was intended to mock Jesus, to trap him, to paint Jesus into a theological corner. Still, their dishonest question may prompt for us our own deeply honest questions about resurrection. After a loved one dies, we can't help but wonder what life is like for them. Will I see them again? Will they know me, or will I know them? Will there be lakes and rivers and mountains in heaven? Will there be dogs and cats in heaven? Will I have any memory of this life at all? The trap that is so easy for us to fall into is to create images and landscapes and scenarios of the afterlife that conform to our hopes of what it will be like. Because this life is all that we've experienced, we can't help but project this life into the next life. But truthfully, the Bible really says very little that might satisfy our longings to know what life will be like after we die. There is more mystery than detail about what our life with God will be like after we die. In Jesus' response to the Sadducees, he first makes a distinction between this age and the age that is to come. God has intentions for this life, for our life together with others in community. There are, of course, in this age, social implications of being a child of God. There are also legitimate questions about death and about what happens after death, about the afterlife. But those are two different discussions, and it's in effect Jesus is trying to suggest, stop trying to combine the two. Don't force this temporary life into the mold of permanence, because God is not God of the dead and the impermanent. He is God of the living and the eternal. Marriage is a common, useful, and for many of us, even a delightful part of this temporary life. Marriage provides companionship, affection, friendship, and community. For many, it provides family that is a part of life that is hard to imagine being without. But the social structures of this life are just that, social structures of this life. Some things will endure and some things will not. The important point that Jesus seems to be driving at is that once someone dies, they are joined to God, and death is no longer part of their experience. They know life. For all who are joined to God are living. Resurrection, of course, is about life. The resurrection reminds the world, it reminds us that God made a partnership with us, a partnership that is aimed toward life that death can never again interrupt. And so to try to force the forms and limitations of this earthly life into an expanse that is a never-ending life with God, only shows the shortcomings of our limited ability to imagine. The life to come, while there will be inevitably some continuity, it will take on a different hue, a different character, a way of being that exceeds the limits of this finite life. To think about resurrection is challenging. It's to learn a lesson in time about that time when there will be no time. Life, we are assured, will be found again on the other side of that doorway that we call death. Even Moses understands this. Remember that story where Moses stood before a burning bush, a bush that was burning but it was not consumed, and while he was standing in front of that burning bush that was not consumed, he heard God's voice. There are some things that are under God's control and not ours, and sometimes things happen that cannot be explained with the rules of a logical and finite universe. God speaks to Moses while the bush does not burn, two impossible things that still enter into the realm of the actual. We can think of no other possibility than to be consumed by death. Yet resurrection teaches us that death will not consume us, that ultimately death will have no sway over us. Jesus goes on to say that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even though they are long since dead and gone. That God is with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's evidence that Jesus cites for resurrection. Yet if you think about it, resurrection happened to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob long before the day of their death. Resurrection for Abraham was going off into a foreign land to receive a child far beyond childbearing years. For Isaac, resurrection was a journey to a foreign land, to one's death, with the hope that there would be life with his brother when he returned home. Resurrection for Jacob was wrestling with God all night and not giving up until there was a blessing. Resurrection for Job was living on even though circumstances should not have allowed him to live on. Resurrection is that daily miracle of persisting, of stubbornly clinging to the promise that God will bring us life. You see, while the Sadducees wanted to trick Jesus with an absurd question about resurrection, Jesus points to that deep and ultimate truth that resurrection is ultimately relevant for each and every day of our lives. To know and believe and trust in resurrection is to let go of the old and embrace the new thing that God is doing in our lives, even at this very moment. This you can trust, Jesus says. God is not the God of the dead, but God is the God of the living. Stand up and stand firm and hold on to this truth, and you will find comfort in disasters large and small, courage to embrace doubts, hope for every day that is to come. In our daily encounters with death, we can practice resurrection. To believe in resurrection is to know in the certainty of a future, the dimensions and wonder of which are far beyond our puny imaginations. In the Sadducees' story, that woman outlives every man in her life. The misfortune of death appears to be her lot in life. But while the Sadducees wanted to focus on death, Jesus instead insists on life, pointing them to Moses as the resurrection of the spirit of their people, for God was with them. resurrection is about how everyone, each one of us, is claimed by God, snatched from the certainty of death, and given a life that never ends. For to God, all of us are alive, now and forever.